A garbage man saves a family from a burning car, risking his life, and ends up in the hospital. But the next day, he learns the shocking truth about the identity of the family members. He immediately left the hospital without saying a word because the faint light of dawn was breaking over the city when Liam Carter, a seasoned garbage man, began his usual route through the quiet suburbs. For the past 10 years, Liam had woken up before the rest of the world to do a job most people never thought about. He didn't mind the work, it was honest, routine, and gave him time to think. His partner for the shift, Joel, was a talkative younger guy who often tried to liven up the early hours with jokes and chatter. Today, though, Liam wasn't in the mood for conversation. He kept his eyes on the road, his hands gripping the steering wheel of their truck. "Earth to Liam," Joel said, breaking the silence. "You good, man?" Liam glanced at him briefly, his face etched with the weariness of someone who carried more than physical burdens. "I'm fine, Joel. Just tired." Joel chuckled. "Aren't we all?" They continued their route in relative quiet, stopping at each designated house to load bags of trash into the compactor. It was an ordinary day, or so Liam thought, until they reached the next neighborhood. The smell of burning rubber hit them first. As they turned a corner, the source of the odor became horrifyingly clear. A car had skidded off the road and crashed into a tree. Flames licked at the crumpled front of the vehicle, thick black smoke billowing into the air. "Holy," Joel started, but Liam was already out of the truck. "Call 911. Liam shouted, sprinting toward the burning car. Joel fumbled for his phone, his hands shaking as he dialed. Liam didn't think about the danger. His only thought was the people inside the car. As he got closer, he could hear the faint cries for help. The heat was intense, and the acrid smoke stung his eyes, but he pressed on, determined to save whoever was trapped. The car doors were warped and wouldn't budge. Liam peered through the shattered driver's side window and saw a woman slumped over the steering wheel. In the back seat, 2 children, no older than 10, were crying and banging on the glass. A man, likely the father, was unconscious in the passenger seat. "Hold on," Liam yelled, adrenaline coursing through his veins. He grabbed a metal rod from the truck's toolbox and jammed it into the driver's door, using all his strength to pry it open. The flames were spreading fast, creeping closer to the back seat. "Liam, the fire department's on their way," Joel called from a safe distance. "Get out of there." Liam ignored him, managing to wrench the door open. He pulled the woman free first, dragging her to safety. She coughed violently but remained conscious. "The kids," she gasped, pointing toward the car. Without hesitation, Liam returned to the burning vehicle. The flames roared louder, and the heat was almost unbearable. He managed to open the back door and unbuckle the 2 terrified children, one at a time, carrying them to where their mother lay. "The father," Liam muttered to himself, his lungs burning with every breath. The fire was consuming the front of the car now, and the man's unconscious form was barely visible through the smoke. Liam climbed into the passenger seat, ignoring the searing pain of the heat against his skin. With a Herculean effort, he dragged the man out just as the fire reached the gas tank. As Liam stumbled away, carrying the father's weight, an explosion ripped through the air. The force knocked him to the ground, but he shielded the man with his body. Debris rained down around them, and Joel came running, yelling something Liam couldn't hear through the ringing in his ears. When the paramedics arrived, they found Liam barely conscious, his body covered in burns and his breathing shallow. The family was rushed to the hospital, and Liam was taken in a separate ambulance. Joel, shaken but unharmed, followed behind. Liam woke up in a hospital bed hours later, the sterile smell of disinfectant filling his nostrils. His arms and face were bandaged, and every muscle in his body ached. A nurse entered, smiling kindly. "You're lucky to be alive," she said. "You're a hero, you know that?" Liam winced as he tried to sit up. "The family? Are they okay?" "They're fine, thanks to you," the nurse said. "Rest now. You've done more than enough." But as Liam drifted back into a fitful sleep, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end of the story. Something about the family lingered in his mind, a sense of familiarity he couldn't place. He would soon learn why. Liam woke the next morning to the sound of hushed voices outside his hospital room. His entire body ached, and the bandages covering his burns itched, but his mind was sharper than ever. The memory of the previous day, the blazing car, the terrified family, the explosion, played on a loop in his head. The voices grew louder. Is he awake? Not yet. The family wants to thank him personally. Liam shifted in his bed, wincing at the pain. He didn't feel ready to face anyone, let alone the family he'd risked his life to save. But curiosity gnawed at him. Who were they? And why did their faces feel so hauntingly familiar? Moments later, the nurse entered the room, followed by a man in a suit. The man exuded an air of authority, his sharp features softened only slightly by the smile he offered Liam. "Mr. Carter," he began, extending a hand. "I'm Detective Miles from the local police department. I just wanted to commend you for what you did yesterday. You saved a family's lives. Not many people would have done what you did." Liam shook the detective's hand, his grip weak but firm. "I just did what needed to be done." "How's the family?" "They're stable," Miles said, his smile fading slightly. "The mother and kids are doing well. The father's in the ICU, but the doctors are optimistic. They've been asking about you." Liam nodded slowly. "That's good. I'm glad they're okay." The detective hesitated, his expression shifting to something more guarded. "Mr. Carter, I'm here for another reason as well. There are some unusual circumstances surrounding the family you rescued." Liam's brow furrowed. "Unusual? What do you mean?" Miles glanced at the door as if ensuring no one was listening. "We've identified the family. The father is a man named Ryan Decker. He's a businessman with ties to some questionable activities, money laundering, fraud, that sort of thing. We've been investigating him for months." Liam felt a pang of unease. "You think the crash wasn't an accident?" "We're not sure yet," Miles admitted. "But the car had extensive damage before it hit the tree. It looks like someone ran them off the road." As the detective left, Liam's thoughts churned. He'd expected gratitude and closure, not cryptic warnings and criminal connections. He couldn't help but wonder if he'd stepped into something far more dangerous than he realized. Later that day, the nurse returned with news that the family wanted to see him. "The mother insisted," she said with a smile. "She said they owe you their lives." Despite his reservations, Liam agreed. Soon, the mother and her 2 children entered the room. The woman, pale but composed, held her kids close as she approached Liam's bedside. "Mr. Carter," she began, her voice trembling with emotion. "I don't know how to thank you. You saved me. You saved my children. If it weren't for you," her voice broke, and tears welled in her eyes. Liam raised a hand to stop her. "You don't owe me anything, ma'am. I'm just glad you're all okay." The little boy, no older than 8, stepped forward. "Thank you for saving us," he said quietly, clutching a toy car in his small hands. Liam managed a faint smile. "You're welcome, kiddo." The woman, whose name was Laura, stayed a little longer, explaining what she could about the crash. "I don't know who would want to hurt us," she said, her hands trembling. "Ryan, my husband. He's made enemies, but this—" Liam could see the fear in her eyes. "Have you talked to the police?" Laura nodded. "They've been questioning Ryan since the accident. I don't know what he's told them, but they seem to think someone wanted to kill him, and they didn't care who else was in the car." That night, as Liam lay awake in his hospital bed, a gnawing sense of dread consumed him. He thought about the fiery wreck, the family's terror, and Detective Miles' cryptic warnings. Something wasn't adding up. Why had the crash felt so deliberate? Who were Ryan's enemies? And why did Liam feel like there was something deeper he wasn't being told? In the early hours of the morning, Liam's uneasy sleep was interrupted by a faint knock at the door. Groggy and disoriented, he called out, "Come in." To his surprise, Joel stepped inside, his face pale and his usual humor absent. "Liam, I need to talk to you." Liam sat up as much as his injuries allowed. "What's going on?" Joel hesitated, his eyes darting to the hallway before he spoke in a low voice. "I overheard some of the cops talking while I was waiting outside. They said Ryan Decker isn't just some shady businessman. He's connected to something big, cartels, maybe worse. Liam's heart sank. Why would they target his family? Then, Joel shook his head. That's the thing. They think someone's trying to send a message. But it gets weirder. The cops said there's a reason Ryan hasn't been arrested yet. He's supposed to be a key witness in a huge federal case. Joel's words hit Liam like a punch to the gut. If Ryan was involved in something that dangerous, saving his family might have put Liam directly in harm's way. I thought you should know, Joel added, his voice barely above a whisper. Be careful, Liam. This whole thing. It doesn't feel right. As Joel left, Liam sat in the darkness, his mind racing. He had saved a family from a burning car, but now it seemed like he'd also saved a man whose secrets could destroy lives, including his own. And the worst part? Liam still couldn't shake the feeling that he'd seen Ryan's face before, long before the accident. Liam barely slept that night. Joel's words lingered in his mind, each revelation adding to the storm of unease growing inside him. Who exactly was Ryan Decker? And why did his face seem so familiar? Liam couldn't shake the feeling that he'd unwittingly stepped into a much bigger and more dangerous story. The next morning, as Liam stared out the hospital window, the events of the accident replayed in his mind. Every detail, every second of the rescue, burned vividly in his memory. It had started as just another stop on their route. Joel was still cracking jokes when the smell of smoke cut through the crisp morning air. Liam had spotted the car first, veering off the road and wedged against a tree, flames licking at its crumpled hood. Liam had slammed on the brakes and jumped out of the truck without a second thought. Call for help, he'd shouted over his shoulder. Liam, wait! Joel had called after him, but Liam was already sprinting toward the burning car. The heat had been overwhelming. As Liam approached, the acrid smell of burning fuel and scorched metal filled his lungs. He could hear cries for help. A woman's voice, raw with panic, and the terrified screams of children. Help us, please. The driver's door was crumpled shut, and the fire was spreading fast. Without thinking, Liam grabbed a metal rod from the truck and wedged it into the doorframe, using all his strength to pry it open. Inside, Laura Decker was struggling to free herself, her hands shaking as she fought with her seatbelt. My kids, she cried, pointing to the back seat where two children were trapped, wide-eyed and sobbing. Liam yanked the driver's door open, reached inside, and freed Laura from the seatbelt. Go! Get clear of the car, he shouted, guiding her to safety. Laura stumbled to the side of the road, coughing and crying, but her eyes never left the car. My babies! Liam turned his attention to the back seat. The fire was growing, the smoke thicker by the second. He could barely see through the haze, but he found the first child, a boy, strapped into his car seat. His tiny hands clutched at the straps, his cries muffled by the roar of the flames. Hang on, buddy, Liam muttered, his voice hoarse. He fumbled with the seatbelt buckle, his fingers slick with sweat, and finally freed the boy. Holding the child against his chest, he stepped out of the car and handed him to Laura. One more, Laura screamed, pointing back toward the car. Liam didn't hesitate. He dove back into the smoke-filled vehicle and found the second child. A little girl no older than 6. Her terrified eyes met his, and she clung to him as he unfastened her seatbelt. You're gonna be okay, Liam murmured, his voice barely audible over the crackling flames. By the time Liam carried the girl to safety, his lungs were burning, and his vision was blurred from the smoke. He handed her to Laura, who clutched both her children tightly, sobbing in relief. But there was still one person left. Liam turned back to the car and saw Ryan Decker slumped against the passenger seat, unconscious and unmoving. Liam, stop! Joel's voice cut through the chaos. It's gonna blow! Liam ignored him. The flames were creeping closer to the gas tank, and time was running out. He grabbed the metal rod again and forced the passenger door open, coughing violently as the smoke overwhelmed him. Ryan was heavy, dead weight in Liam's arms, but he managed to drag him free just as the fire reached the gas tank. An explosion rocked the air, throwing Liam and Ryan to the ground. Debris rained down around them, and for a moment, Liam thought he wouldn't get back up. But then Joel was there, pulling him to his feet, shouting something he couldn't hear through the ringing in his ears. "Go!" Liam rasped, shoving Ryan into Joel's arms. "Get him out of here." The last thing Liam remembered before collapsing was the sight of Laura and her children, safe and alive, watching him with tear-streaked faces. Now, sitting in his hospital bed, Liam rubbed his temples as he tried to piece everything together. The rescue had been instinctual, a blur of adrenaline and desperation. But now, with Joel's warnings and Detective Miles' revelations, Liam couldn't shake the feeling that he'd stepped into a game far more dangerous than he realized. Later that day, Detective Miles returned to Liam's room, his expression grave. "Mr. Carter, I wanted to let you know we've uncovered some new information about the crash." Liam sat up as much as his injuries would allow, wincing. "What did you find?" Miles hesitated before answering. The damage to the Decker family's car wasn't consistent with an accident. Someone ran them off the road, and we believe it was intentional. Liam's stomach churned. "Why? Who would do that?" Miles glanced toward the window, his face lined with tension. "Ryan Decker has been cooperating with federal investigators. He's a key witness in a major case involving organized crime. Whoever went after him wasn't just targeting him. They were sending a message." Liam's chest tightened. "And his family? They didn't care if they died too." Miles shook his head. "These people don't care about collateral damage." As the detective left, Liam stared at the ceiling, his mind racing. He had saved a family from a fiery death, but now he couldn't help but wonder. Had he also made himself a target? And why did Ryan Decker's face still feel so hauntingly familiar? Liam's restless nights stretched into dawn, the questions about Ryan Decker swirling in his mind. The memories of the crash replayed on a loop, but they only brought him closer to the same, unsettling truth. Ryan wasn't just a man in the wrong place at the wrong time. The morning came with a surprise visitor, Laura Decker. She entered the room hesitantly, her face pale but determined. She carried a bouquet of flowers, which she set on the bedside table before sitting down beside Liam. "I owe you an explanation," she began, her voice trembling. Liam straightened in his bed, the tension in his shoulders increasing. "You don't owe me anything, Mrs. Decker. You and your kids are safe. That's what matters." Laura shook her head. "No. You deserve to know why all this happened." She took a deep breath, her hands twisting in her lap. "My husband, Ryan, he's not the man I thought he was when I married him. For years, he's been involved with people, dangerous people, who launder money and traffic weapons. He told me it was just business, but I found out it was more than that." Liam's jaw tightened. "What do you mean, more than that?" Laura hesitated, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Ryan started cooperating with the authorities a few months ago. He's giving them information about his partners, their operations, everything. He thought he could keep us safe, but you saw what happened." Liam felt a chill run down his spine. "The crash wasn't an accident." Laura nodded, her eyes welling with tears. "They were trying to kill him, and they didn't care if they killed me or the kids in the process." Liam clenched his fists, anger boiling beneath the surface. He'd risked his life to save Ryan, only to learn the man's secrets had put innocent lives in jeopardy. "Why didn't he go to the police sooner?" Liam asked, his voice sharp. Laura looked down, shame flickering across her face. "Because he was afraid, and because he thought he could control it. He thought he could make things right without exposing everything." "Everything?" Liam pressed, leaning forward despite the ache in his ribs. She met his gaze, and Liam saw a flicker of fear in her eyes. "Ryan knows things about people in high places, politicians, CEOs, even law enforcement. If he exposes them, it won't just be the criminals coming for him." The weight of her words settled over Liam like a lead blanket. This wasn't just about Ryan or the crash. It was about a network of corruption that extended far beyond one man's life. As Laura stood to leave, she placed a hand on Liam's arm. "Thank you for saving us. I don't know how to repay you." Liam shook his head. "You don't need to repay me. Just keep your kids safe." Laura nodded, her lips quivering as she turned and left the room. Later that day, Detective Miles returned, his face grim. "Mr. Carter, we've received new intel about the people targeting the Decker family. They're not done." Liam's heart sank. "What do you mean?" Miles pulled out a folder and flipped it open, revealing surveillance photos of a group of men gathered outside a nondescript building. "These guys are professionals. We've linked them to a string of high-profile assassinations. They're cleaning house and Ryan Decker's on their list." Liam frowned, his instincts screaming that something worse was coming. "What about Laura and the kids?" "They're being moved to a safer location," Miles assured him. "But it's not just them who are at risk." Liam's chest tightened. "What are you saying?" Miles fixed him with a serious look. "They know about you. They know you're the one who saved them. That makes you a loose end." That night, Liam lay in his hospital bed, staring at the ceiling. Every muscle in his body ached, but it was nothing compared to the storm raging in his mind. The people who had tried to kill the Decker family wouldn't stop. And now they were coming for him too. Sleep didn't come easily. When it finally did, it was restless, filled with fragmented dreams of fire and shadowy figures chasing him through the night. The next morning, Liam's door creaked open, and Joel stepped inside, his face pale. "Liam," he said urgently, "we've got a problem." Liam sat up, wincing as his burns protested the movement. "What is it?" Joel held up a crumpled piece of paper. "I found this on my truck this morning." Liam took the note, his blood running cold as he read the scrawled words. "You saved the wrong people. You're next." Joel looked around nervously. "What the hell's going on, Liam? Who are these people?" Liam's grip on the note tightened. "They're the kind of people who don't leave loose ends." Joel's face went pale. "You think they're coming for you?" "I know they are," Liam said grimly, "and I'm not going to sit around waiting for them." As the sun set, Liam made a decision. He wasn't going to let the people who had tried to kill Laura and her kids win. If they wanted to come after him, he'd be ready. And he wouldn't go down without a fight. He called Detective Miles. "You said these guys are professionals. If they want me, they'll come to finish the job." Miles hesitated. "That's likely." "Good," Liam said, his voice hard. "Let's set a trap." The tension in Liam's hospital room was palpable as he sat across from Detective Miles, outlining their plan. His injuries still ached, but he ignored the pain. If they were going to draw these people out, it had to happen soon, before they made another attempt on the Decker family or anyone else connected to this mess. "You're sure about this?" Miles asked, his brow furrowed. "You'd be putting yourself directly in harm's way." Liam nodded firmly. "They're coming for me whether I like it or not. If we wait, they'll have the upper hand. This way, we control the situation." Miles sighed. "All right, but you're not doing this alone. I'll have a team nearby, ready to move in the moment things go south." The plan was simple. Liam would check himself out of the hospital and return to his modest apartment on the edge of the city. The location was easily surveilled and isolated enough to avoid collateral damage. Miles' team would set up in unmarked vehicles nearby, waiting for any sign of movement. Liam didn't tell Joel about the plan. He'd already put his partner in enough danger. Instead, he made a quiet phone call to Laura. "You and the kids doing okay?" he asked. "We're safe," she replied, her voice soft but steady. "The police moved us to a new place. It's quiet, and the kids are adjusting." "Good," Liam said. "Stay there. Don't leave unless Miles tells you to." There was a pause on the line before Laura spoke again. "Liam, please be careful. If anything happens to you—" "I'll be fine," he interrupted, though he wasn't entirely sure it was true. "Just take care of your kids." By the time Liam arrived at his apartment that evening, the city was bathed in the golden light of sunset. He walked through the door, his senses on high alert. Everything was exactly as he'd left it. His worn couch, the small dining table, the stack of unread mail by the door. It all felt surreal, as though it belonged to a simpler time before his life had become a target. He left the front blinds slightly open, just enough to give the impression he wasn't expecting trouble. Then he settled onto the couch with a cold glass of water, waiting for nightfall. Hours passed in silence. Outside, The occasional rumble of a passing car or distant siren reminded Liam that the world was still moving, oblivious to the danger lurking in the shadows. He glanced at the clock on the wall. It was nearing midnight. Then he heard it, the faint crunch of footsteps on gravel outside his window. Liam's pulse quickened. He set the glass down silently and moved toward the kitchen, where he'd stashed a heavy wrench earlier in the evening. He grabbed it, the cold steel reassuring in his hand, and waited. The footsteps grew closer, stopping just outside the front door. There was a soft click as someone tested the handle. Liam's breath slowed, his grip tightening on the wrench. He waited for the sound of the lock being forced, but it never came. Instead, the faintest creak of a floorboard told him someone was circling toward the back. From his hiding spot in the kitchen, Liam peered toward the rear window. A shadow moved against the curtains, and he saw the glint of something metallic in the intruder's hand. His instincts screamed at him to act, but he forced himself to wait, just a little longer. The back door creaked open, and a tall figure slipped inside, moving with practiced precision. The man wore dark clothing, his face obscured by a mask, and in his hand was a silenced pistol. Liam's heart pounded, but his grip on the wrench remained steady. He let the man step deeper into the room before striking. With a swift, powerful swing, he brought the wrench down on the intruder's arm. The man cried out, dropping the gun, but he recovered quickly, lunging at Liam with surprising speed. The two men grappled, knocking over furniture as they struggled for control. The intruder was strong and well-trained, but Liam's raw determination kept him in the fight. He landed a solid punch to the man's ribs, forcing him to stumble back. Before the intruder could recover, the room was flooded with blinding light. "Freeze! Hands in the air!" Detective Miles' voice boomed as officers stormed in, their weapons drawn. The intruder hesitated, then made a break for the back door. He didn't get far. Miles tackled him to the ground, pinning him with practiced ease. As the officers cuffed the man and dragged him outside, Liam slumped against the wall, his chest heaving. "That all of them?" he asked, his voice rough. Miles nodded, though his expression remained serious. "For now. But we need to move quickly. If he was here, others won't be far behind." Liam frowned. "What do you mean?" Miles pulled out a small device he'd taken from the intruder, a phone with an open message on the screen. "Target in position. Moving in. They're coordinating," Miles said. This guy was just the first wave. As the team secured the apartment and prepared for the next stage of the operation, Liam felt a cold knot of fear in his stomach. The people after him weren't just thugs, they were professionals. And if the message on the phone was any indication, they weren't going to stop until they got what they came for. Liam tightened his grip on the wrench, his jaw set. He wasn't going to let them win. Not tonight. Not ever. Liam sat in the makeshift command center set up in an unmarked van outside his apartment. Detective Miles leaned over a table littered with surveillance equipment, his expression grim. The intercepted message had confirmed what Liam feared. The intruder was just the beginning. "They're sending more," Miles said, pointing to a screen showing a live feed of the area around Liam's apartment. "We've identified at least 2 vehicles circling the block. They'll make their move soon." Liam clenched his fists. "Then we end it here." Miles nodded, his tone resolute. "We'll draw them in, but you stay out of sight this time. My team will handle the rest." Liam shook his head. "They're not here for your team. They're here for me. I'll do whatever it takes to keep their focus on me." Miles opened his mouth to argue but stopped when his radio crackled. "Detective, we've got movement," a voice said. 2 SUVs just parked on the east side. The plan was simple. Make the attackers believe Liam was alone and unprotected. Miles' team had positioned themselves strategically around the apartment, ready to strike when the moment was right. Liam returned to his apartment, leaving the lights on and blinds open to make it look like business as usual. Minutes stretched into tense silence as Liam waited. He stood by the kitchen, gripping the wrench he'd used earlier, his pulse pounding in his ears. Then the sound came, the faint crunch of gravel outside and the murmur of hushed voices. They were here. The first man entered through the front door, moving swiftly and silently. Liam stayed out of sight, his heart racing. From the corner of his eye, he saw two more figures slip through the back, their movements coordinated. Liam's instincts screamed at him to act, but he held his ground. The plan depended on him playing bait. He waited until the intruders were fully inside before stepping into the living room, the wrench dangling loosely in his hand. "Looking for me?" Liam said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. The men froze for a moment, surprised. Then one of them raised his gun. "Smart mouth for a dead man," the intruder sneered. Before the man could pull the trigger, the room erupted in chaos. Smoke grenades burst through the windows, filling the apartment with thick, choking clouds. Miles' team moved in, their commands echoing through the haze. "Drop your weapons. Hands on the ground." Liam dropped low, crawling toward the kitchen as gunfire erupted. The intruders weren't going down without a fight. Shots cracked through the smoke-filled room, and Liam heard the shouts of both officers and attackers. One of the men, disoriented by the smoke, stumbled into the kitchen. He spotted Liam and lunged, grabbing him by the collar. Liam reacted instinctively, swinging the wrench with all his strength. The man collapsed, unconscious. Liam grabbed the man's weapon and moved cautiously back toward the living room. The smoke was clearing, and he could see the intruders being subdued one by one. Miles and his team worked with precision, neutralizing the attackers without taking unnecessary risks. By the time the gunfire stopped, the apartment was a wreck. Furniture was overturned, bullet holes riddled the walls, and the smell of smoke lingered in the air. Liam leaned against the counter, his breathing heavy as the last intruder was dragged out in cuffs. Miles approached, his expression a mix of relief and exhaustion. "You all right?" Liam nodded, though his hands were still trembling. "Yeah, it's over." Miles gave a tight smile. "For now. We've got their men, their vehicles, and their communications. This should be enough to dismantle their network, or at least cripple it." The following day, Liam sat in Miles' office, going over the aftermath of the operation. The attackers were in custody, and the authorities were already tracing their connections back to the higher-ups. The Decker family remained in protective custody, safe for the time being. But there was one lingering question that haunted Liam. "Who were they working for?" he asked. Miles hesitated, then handed Liam a folder. Inside were documents linking the attackers to a criminal syndicate, one with ties to politicians, corporations, and law enforcement. Liam's stomach turned. "This isn't just about Ryan Decker, is it?" "No," Miles admitted. "Ryan's testimony is just the tip of the iceberg. What you uncovered. It's bigger than any of us realized." Liam left the office with a heavy heart. The events of the past week had changed him, and he knew his life would never go back to the way it was. As he walked through the quiet streets, he thought of Laura and her children, of the danger they still faced, and of the secrets Ryan Decker was fighting to expose. Liam had stepped into a world of corruption and violence, but he'd also found something he hadn't expected, a sense of purpose. He'd saved lives, stood up against impossible odds, and uncovered truths that others were too afraid to face. He wasn't a cop or a soldier. He was just a garbage man. But for the first time in a long time, Liam Carter felt like a hero.